The story of World War II and the atrocities committed by Hitler and the Nazis is well known in the West. Less well known is how our ally, Soviet leader Joseph Stalin, used the war to occupy Eastern Europe. He imposed a 50-year rule of terror on formerly free nations. Days before Hitler invaded Poland, launching World War II, he and Stalin secretly agreed to divide Eastern Europe between them. Stalin took the Baltic republics, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. He immediately sent Moscow-trained communists and his secret police to seize control of the governments. Together, they began to deport tens of thousands of Estonians, Latvians, and Lithuanians from their homes to the Siberian wilderness.
Mes 1940.
In the spring of 1941, after the Russians came to Lithuania, we had left our house and gone into hiding at my uncle's farm because we were afraid that Father was going to be arrested. The Soviets were arresting all the men, but on the night of the 13th, my father and brother Romas reached the farm. Later that same night, Lithuanian and Russian communists came and arrested us all. Red Army soldiers burst into the farmhouse. They ordered us to be ready to leave in 2 hours. Mother started to pack some of our things, but Father told her to stop it. They're going to kill us all anyway, he said. We were convinced that they were going to shoot us. We had practically nothing with us. I was in sandals and a summer dress. I was 11. They put us in a truck, and we drove to the railroad station. It was already very crowded. People were upset, crying, and then some soldiers grabbed my father and started to drag him away. I was hanging on to him, and I began screaming. I wouldn't let go of him. So they beat at us with their rifles and pulled me away. Then they pushed Mother and Romas and me toward other cattle cars. We were packed in with many women and children. But somehow I managed to slip out of the car. I wanted to look for my father. I ran along the train. By now, many more people had arrived at the station, shouting and looking for their own relatives. I was screaming for my father, "Velitis, Velitis!" And then from inside one of the cattle cars, packed with men, someone called to me. I stopped, and I peeked in through a crack. The men inside were all crowded together in the summer heat, like matches in a box. Their shirts were off, sweat running down their bodies. Father managed to squeeze through them to an opening, and he pulled off his wedding ring and slipped it to me through the slat. "You will need this to feed yourselves. Give this to your mother. You'll need it for food. And tell Romas, from now on, he's got to take care of the family." Then the soldiers grabbed me and dragged me back to the other car. That was the last time I ever saw my father.
Lithuanians knew that people were disappearing, but they didn't know where they were being taken or what was happening to them. No one ever expected that the Kremlin would actually begin to destroy Lithuania and would use these massive arrests, deportations, and terror to do it. They began preparing for the deportations in the autumn of 1940. The first thing they did was make a list, a register of all potential enemies. And the register came to over 350,000 names, so-called enemies. Including their families, that comes to half of Lithuania. Then in 1941, They decided to deport the ones they considered to be the most important enemies. So on the night of June 14th, after the families were arrested, they were brought to the railway stations. The men were separated and shipped in cattle cars to the Gulag, slave labor camps, and the women and children were sent into the wilderness in Siberia. These deportations had a traumatic effect on the country. Everyone had someone taken away from them. No one knew what had happened to them. And after such massive disruptions in their lives, the people were prepared to welcome anyone who would rescue them from this Soviet terror. What happened in 1941 was all planned in Moscow. And after World War II, as the Soviets returned to Lithuania and the Baltic states, the people who ran the first deportations came back with even more schemes for terror in order to finish the restructuring they had started.
The Soviets ruled by fear, and the fear was of the secret police and their spies. The fear of being arrested, taken to secret police headquarters, and being interrogated for days, weeks, and even months. In many cases, the arrested never returned to their homes. It was impossible to find out what happened to missing loved ones. Before long, everyone had someone taken away. People lived in terror of the police showing up in their neighborhood, knocking on the door of their apartment or house.
In 1940, they came and took my father, and we had no idea what happened to him. He just disappeared and was gone. My mother and grandmother and 5 of us children were left behind. I was the oldest, 9. My mother was hysterical. The baby was just 2 weeks old, and he died soon afterwards, maybe of shock. Then, one day in 1946, I was away from the house, and my mother had gone to the KGB jail to bring food to my brother, who had been arrested. That day when we were gone, they came and took away my grandmother and my baby brother and sisters. They were deported to Siberia. I thought my mother was going to lose her mind. My baby brother and sisters and grandma were in Russia for 9 months. When they returned, they were so sick and starving, almost dead. Mother didn't recognize them at all. And then again, on top of all this suffering, in the spring of 1948, the Soviets came again and deported all of us. They arrived at night and said, "Get ready, you're going to Siberia." But Mother asked, "Why are you deporting us? We're not rich. We're not criminals. We have nothing. We haven't done anything." And they said, "We were ordered to do it, and so we are deporting you. Pack up only what you can carry."
Terror was a viable part, but it was also part of the ideology that was built on antagonism, on a warlike ethos. Battle with enemies, real and imagined, weeding out enemies, again, real and imagined, of the Soviet regime, of Bolshevik ideology, individual and groups who were considered to be sworn enemies of the system. Some of them could be reformed, rehabilitated, reintegrated into the system. Some of them could not, hence they would be deported and many of them executed. Terror in this sense is a critical part, integral part of the system, keeping the population in line and keeping the gap between reality, social realities, and the official claims more or less manageable.
34 žmonės. Tai buvo išvežta iš kaimo 41 ir 48. Pokarį.
As the war was ending, the Russians came back, and in our village, life was steeped in an atmosphere of fear. The fear that we were going to be deported, the fear that our young men would be shot, fear because people were being abused and molested, and there was constant thieving. Our property was being taken by the Soviets. There was an oppressive sense of terror, and we didn't know when it would end. We lived with fear, day and night. The Soviets used local thugs to do their dirty work. Lowlifes, really, people we knew who were criminals, and they put them in charge. We called them stribai. They would come to our houses and they would say they were looking for something, whatever. But then they would go through everything, clean us out, our food, the farm tools, any money. Everything was up for grabs, and they terrorized us. Even as a kid, I despised them. But they motivated a lot of our young people to go off into the woods and resist. Of course, all the men were gone by now, killed by the Germans and the Soviets, or arrested and taken away. Only kids and old men and women were left, but we started to resist. I was too young at the time, but my middle brother, a teenager too young for the army, he and his friends began gearing up to fight. All teenagers had weapons stashed away. They had them as a point of honor. Almost worse than the other KGB horrors. The deportations and torture was what they did to our young who tried to resist. As a matter of policy, they killed young resistors and dumped their bodies in the village square. They'd force everyone in the village to come and watch, and they would observe the reactions and pick out family members of the deceased and desecrated. Then they would be arrested. People were shaken to the core, grief-stricken over this. The stribai stripped the clothes off the bodies, even from the women. These KGB collaborators, they were Lithuanians. They would poke at the corpses with sticks and push their genitalia around. They would shove rosaries and prayer books in their mouths. You were not allowed to bury your dead. It was cruel and gruesome and shocked all of us to the core. This business, making you leave the bodies there like dead dogs, this was unheard of. At least when the Germans shot you, they just shot you. But the KGB made us leave the bodies in the square for weeks. They dumped straw over the bodies, and animals would come and forage among them.
Pirmą kartą aš buvau suimtas.
The first time I was arrested was for participating in a resistance movement. I was part of an underground organization. We were working with the partisans in Western Lithuania. Eventually, they identified us, and in the spring of 1948, I was arrested and convicted of anti-Soviet activities. The sentencing took place in Vilnius. I received 25 years, which I served in different slave labor camps scattered throughout Russia.
When you were arrested, did you have any lawyer with you or anyone on your side?
Kada mane pirmą kartą suėmė?
I was 17 the first time they arrested me. By the time of my second arrest, I was 29, married with a baby on the way. The KGB came on Christmas Eve and took me to their prison. The Russian commander who interrogated me told me that our struggle was pointless. 35,000 Lithuanian partisani have already lost their lives, he said. You should give up this futile fight.
Nes ir šiaip jau Lietuvos partizanų žuvo 35 000 vyrų.
Bet kokia religinė spauda. Aš labai stokoju, kad katalikai tos spaudos.
1974 metais, rugpjūčio.
On August 27, 1974, 14 agents forced their way into my apartment. During those times, a number of underground publications were being produced, and I was in the process of typing one of them. I had just finished typing 6 pages. They searched and found them, and I was arrested and incarcerated in a KGB prison. For 9 months, they interrogated me. The KGB's worst torture consisted in taking a healthy person and locking them up in a psychiatric hospital. Then they would give them electric shock treatments. It didn't take long for these so-called treatments to start destroying the body. Before my arrest, my neighbor, a poet, was arrested and locked up in the Vilnius Psychiatric Hospital. All the psychiatric hospitals were run by the KGB. They used electroshock therapy on him, as well as different kinds of chemical treatments. After 4 months, his wife was allowed to visit him. She told me he could no longer speak, had put on 90 pounds, and one by one, his liver and kidneys and other organs began to collapse. This kind of torture ends in a slow, terrible death.
As soon as the Soviets pushed the Nazis from the Baltics, they decreed that all the young men had to show up for induction into the Red Army, which was in desperate need of more soldiers. Many young men decided that they would rather fight for Lithuania, so they defied the Soviet decree, fled into the forests, and joined up with the groups that were forming a partisan army. This partisan army became one of the most organized and effective forces the Soviets had ever faced. Using open battles and guerrilla tactics, these young Lithuanian soldiers developed into a regular army that slowed down the Soviet takeover for several years.
Jie patys, vat kad ir aš išgyvenęs 12 metų Rusijoje ir aš mačiau, kaip sako, patys, daug čia tos istorijos yra, bet aš nesiplėsiu.
Toward the end of the war, when the Nazis began retreating and the Russians returned, we knew what was in store for us. The Russians were brutal to the Lithuanians. They would force the men to join the Red Army, march them away, send them to the front, which meant certain death, or sometimes they just shot them on the spot. So we started to hide. That's when we became partisans. At the time I was 21 years old. I met Adolphus Raudonasis, the leader here, who had built summer bunkers in this area. In the winter of 1944, Raudonasis, who used the code name Hawk, asked if they could build a secret underground bunker on my father's farm. Because of the location near the river, this bunker became the central command post for the partisan movement of Lithuania.
The young partisans were farmers, used to plows, working with their hands. They were not professional in the use of guns. I have so many good memories of the partisans. When they showed up in your village, you felt more confident. They were such handsome young men, proud in their uniforms, disciplined. They were so different from the stribai, who were crude and cruel. Of course, the partisans were outnumbered and suffered great casualties. So things went from bad to worse. Soviet terror was so far-reaching, entire villages were destroyed, wiped off the map. Farms were burned. Our institutions and traditions were uprooted. Everything was turned upside down. There was no rule of law, and there was a total lack of morality.
Kada užėjo rusai, tai kariuomenė kur eiti reiškia. Eit fronten.
When the Russians came back, they ordered all young men to sign up for the Red Army. They needed them on the front to fight the retreating Germans, and this meant certain death. So instead, my friends talked about going into the forest and hiding out for a while, because we all expected the Russians to leave in a few years. And that is how the partisan movement started. The Russians were ruthless, deporting people who had done nothing, shooting innocent people, taking our land. In our village, there was a 16-year-old boy, who was on his way to school. The KGB soldiers took him down by the lake. They tortured him, broke his arms, then they killed him. For me, life in the bunker was not difficult because we all knew why we were there and what we were fighting for. But it was dangerous. One time I was in a bunker out in the woods, and there was a lot of Soviet activity.
На одном из участков было обнаружено подземное убежище. Командир подразделения подал команду. Подразделению поиск на достигнутом рубеже временно приостановить и подготовиться к бою. Одним отделением окружить подземное убежище.
KGB soldiers were poking rods into the ground in order to find us. That time was difficult because it was wet, rainy, and cold, and we literally had to stay underground for days, sometimes even weeks on end. I spent 10 years in the forest, in the bunkers, from 1943 to 53, 10 years underground. We fought right up to the very end. Finally, I was betrayed by one of my own commanders, and they forced him to collaborate.
Neduoda, sakau, ir viskas. Tai šitas iš Utenos. Kokia ją ten buvo, kas ten, tai aš nežinau, kokia ją ten pareiga buvo. Tai sako, ką jūs galvojat, sako, kad jūs neduodat. Nebežinau, nuo ką pradėti.
I don't know where to start. I was a liaison with the partisans here. We were all friends from childhood. The Soviets suspected me, and they started to bring me in for questioning, and then they let me go. One night, during interrogations, I saw a dear friend of mine. He was from my village, and we married soon after. My interrogators asked me, "Do you know him?" Of course I knew him. We grew up together. Jonas had been arrested for his underground activities, and they wanted me to betray him. Those were really difficult times, and the communists tried to convince us that if we went along with their program, things would get better. And you know, we were almost convinced. They guaranteed everything. They gave us documents. They promised to leave us alone. So why wouldn't we trust them? In life, you have to trust someone or something. But this trust was stupid.
Norint išvengti blogesnio, kadangi 44 metais rugsėjo 8 užėjus ant...
I was arrested when I was 17. I was found with weapons and no permit. When the Germans were retreating, they left a lot of guns and ammunition behind them in the trenches. So me and my friends, we collected everything we could get our hands on and stored it all in one place. A couple of months later, the Russians arrived. The KGB, with local informers, arrested us for having these guns. The youngest of my friends was 13 years old. I was interrogated, tried, and sentenced to 5 years in prison in Vilnius. Later, I was transported to a slave labor camp. After prison, when I came back home, my father didn't think I would survive because I had lost so much weight due to starvation. Also, the Soviets wanted me to register for the army, so I started to hide in the forest. And I became friendly with the partisans who lived there. I wanted to join them, but they said no, it was too dangerous. I was young, and I liked these guys in uniform. It was very romantic, and I kept pestering them. They did trust me because I had spent time in a slave labor camp. So when it became clear that I was going to be arrested again by the Soviets, they let me join.
The partisan movement literally went underground after the Soviets sent their special KGB soldiers into Lithuania. They wanted to eliminate all military resistors. We dug these bunkers at first on farms, then later in the forests only. That's how we got the name, the Forest Brethren. We built these bunkers along rivers and streams so we could walk around without leaving footprints. Here we set up rather sophisticated communication stations. We also published many different kinds of newsletters for public distribution. The partisans wrote and published our present Constitution in these bunkers. We never dreamed we would ever see the day when it became the rule of law. But our dreams and determination really kept us going up until the late 50s. After that, we were all either killed or in prison. Then the Soviets could do whatever they wanted. But we slowed the Soviets down, and later we became the inspiration for the dissidents of the 70s and 80s.
The leaders of the resistance, and they opened me to the possibility of more concrete fight, and I went inside.
Man rezistencija buvo daug įdomesnis dalykas negu plaukimas pasroviui. Man ir dabar kartais, nors jau dabar žinoma amžius.
I was a resistor later on during the occupation. For me and my friends, resistance was more interesting than just going with the flow. And so I chose the life of a dissident. Of course, at the beginning, you don't expect that it will cost you much, like your freedom, for you and your family. But under the Soviets, any kind of dissent was met with terrible reprisals. And this was up to the very end, even under Gorbachev. I was about 16 years old when I started my underground activities. At first, I took part in illegal discussions and meetings. We would read forbidden Lithuanian literature and discuss our history. Some of us would walk around Vilnius going to all our important national monuments and talking about what they meant to us. This was all considered antisocial behavior by the Soviets. It was illegal to do this. Eventually, I became involved in the creation of an underground press, where I worked with older, more experienced people who knew our history and literary traditions very well. I was good at typing and editing. I would go to the house of a dissident and bring back all sorts of stories and articles I had copied down in my own handwriting. So if I was caught and arrested on the way home, no one else would be implicated. Then I would type them up and drop them off to another dissident who would print up copies for distribution.
Lenin and Stalin were expert at using all the tools of mass propaganda, from colorful posters to great public rallies. They used these to promote their own power and communicate the success of the communist revolution. But the gap between the glowing promises and the reality that the Russian people lived with every day, famine, shortage of goods, police arrests, and the many failures of the system, started causing popular discontent. So the propaganda was now turned against dissent and dissenters. People were warned not to criticize the Soviet state and were encouraged to get rid of anyone who did. This led to the arrest and condemnation of millions of people to jail, exile, the Gulag slave labor camps, even death.
The government came to precinct number 58 to cast their ballots. From that precinct, Chelukov, a Moscow metalworker, was elected. Voroshilov, Kaganovich, Molotov, Stalin, Mikoyan.
Part of the Soviet propaganda system involved a bizarre attempt to present a public face guaranteeing due process and universal civil rights. But in reality, the government was accountable to no one and did what it wanted. People learned that there was no place for free expression, dissent, or disagreement.
During these hours, the results of the elections were being summed up throughout the country. 99% of the electorate took part in the election throughout the Soviet Union, while the participation in Moscow was 99.99%. All those elected were candidates of the bloc of the communists and the non-party people. Stalin was elected first deputy to Supreme Soviets of all the Union and autonomous republics. The people greeted their representatives with a grand demonstration. The elections demonstrated the unity of the Soviet people, their invincible moral strength, and the political might of the USSR.
Terror was critical for the Soviet system in sustaining the gap between reality and the lofty utopian claims that the system made. How long can you sustain belief in utopian goals that the population was showered and bombarded with? At a certain point, this gap between what the Soviets were claiming to do and what they were actually achieving were about to expand, and the gap would be unbridgeable.
After months of traveling, packed in cattle cars, we arrived in Siberia. It was raining very hard. Buyers were arriving, but we were being sold only by the wagon load. So the contractors couldn't pick and choose. They had to buy the whole group of us. But no one wanted a trainload of women and little children. So it was 2 weeks before a company in the Altai region bought us to cut trees. Then we had to walk another 8 days into the mountains. At night, we just sat in the cold with no protection. I was still wearing the same summer dress and sandals. All of us were still wearing the same things we had on when we were arrested. A year later, when the work in the forest was done, we were herded into cattle cars for another miserable 2-month trip, this time to the Lena River. There they forced us onto barges. It was a long trip down the Lena River toward a part of the Arctic Ocean called the Laptev Sea. We were dumped off on desolate, empty islands, thousands of us. Frozen earth. Nothing grew there. Very rough KGB commanders with rifles organized us into work brigades. My brother Romas decided to work in the fishing brigade because they promised him extra food. It was dangerous work. They had to wade into the water among the ice floe, and in August the water was already freezing. He was still wearing his high school shirt and pants, all torn to pieces by a year of cruel labor. But Father had said that Romas was to provide food for us, and he was determined to get us food, as Father had said. Mother died later that winter, but I think I am alive today because of Romas's work. I was in the children's brigade, and we pulled logs out of the water. We were all under 13 years old. Everyone had to work in order to get food coupons, and you needed coupons to eat. We worked 12 or 13 hours a day, and if they said more, we had to work more, 7 days a week. After 1 week of terrible work, I was paid 3 rubles in coupons, not even enough for a loaf of bread. I sat on the shore and cried all by myself after that. I wanted to help my family so much, but I couldn't even earn a loaf of bread. It was very hard work, especially when the snow started in September. Frozen sludge covered the water. Our clothes began to ice over, and we still didn't have huts to live in.
After I was sentenced 25 years of hard labor, I was shipped off to the Urals, to a slave labor camp. All political prisoners had to perform the absolutely hardest labor: forestry, mining, construction. It was dangerous and unsafe. On top of the hard work, there was very little food and we were starving. Many prisoners died. Huge numbers starved to death. And this was by plan. It was a kind of torture. Sometimes they would have us do work that was entirely pointless. But we had been labeled enemies of the people, and the enemies of the people had to be liquidated, that is, eliminated. That was the official line, and they were quite open about it. The prison camp where I was located wasn't a big one, about 3,000 people. But camps like these were spread out all over the entire USSR. So in actuality, millions of people were incarcerated as political prisoners at this time. In fact, there were tens of thousands of these slave labor camps all over Russia, even as far east as the Magadan region. I was a political prisoner because I was struggling for my nation's freedom, which is the highest political goal. But I was reduced to the position of being a slave. None of us had any rights. We had absolutely no rights, none of the basic rights that are granted to prisoners in other countries. But that was all part of their plan.
After my arrest in 1957, there was an official trial, and I was sentenced to 4 years of hard labor in a concentration camp. They transported me to a lager in a region in Siberia, in a special cattle car for prisoners called a Stolypin. I also spent time in a prison in Vilnius before they shipped all of us to the Gulag. I was in Siberia 3 years, but the majority of Lithuanian prisoners were there for 15 to 25 years. And it was almost embarrassing for me, since they would kid me that I had a child sentence compared to them.
During my months of questioning, they threatened to pack me off to a psychiatric hospital, where I would face the same fate as my neighbor, the poet that I told you about. Being in a psychiatric hospital was 100 times worse than being in this prison. But even this prison was terrible, and during my time in this cell, I became very sick. My hair fell out. I lost over 40 pounds. My own brother didn't recognize me. It got to the point where I couldn't even walk. They had to carry me out of the cell. Later on, I found out the guards had placed 2 X-rays in the little room next to my cell, aimed right at me, and had used them on me till I was nearly dead. These methods used by the KGB were meant to terrify prisoners into fearing they were going to die. If people didn't want to die, and if their resolve weakened, then they would start bargaining for their lives. And so they began answering questions that didn't seem important or relevant. But the interrogators were just trying to get them to trip up. It was against the law to lie to an interrogator. If they were caught in a lie, anything could happen to them. So the interrogators used this fear to get confessions.
Soviet terror had a devastating effect in our lives. Most of our leaders were killed by this time, or had fled. The partisans had been killed off. Our institutions, our folk traditions, the moral fabric of our rural villages started to disintegrate. The bases of our moral authority were gone. Ultimately, people were set up to distrust each other, and this was all in preparation for collectivization. All the foundations of morality had to be undermined in order to justify what the Soviets were going to do to us. Then we were all herded into collective farms. This meant our property was seized along with the crops and the tools. The farm animals, our houses, everything taken. We were now working for the state. The Soviet system was so coercive that everyone was forced to compromise in some way or other just to survive. So everyone felt compromised, even guilty, forced into shameful choices just to survive. What was always right for us now became officially wrong, like respect for private property. Our traditions were called evil, and what was always wrong for us, namely denying any sense of human or personal rights, became the official state policy. This was obviously a setup for the collectivization plan, which of course meant taking everyone's property.
Bet ne tikai rūpnīcu, arī lauku darba ļaudīm aizvadītais gads bijis devīgs.
Replacing private property with collective farms was central to Soviet theory. Propaganda and coercion were used to promote belief in the success of this social and economic experiment. Throughout the Soviet Empire, farmers tried to resist, but they were powerless against the communist state.
Mūsų grupė tai buvo.
My underground work was quickly brought to the attention of the KGB. Even though I was still only a teenager, they would call me in for interrogations. They would search our flat, my room, confiscate everything. Of course, they would take my typewriter because they were building a case against me. But I would just get another typewriter and continue plugging away. I really didn't hide what I was doing. On the morning of December 11th, 1979, government agents came to my place, told me to get ready to go to the KGB headquarters, and I knew that I was being arrested. I was put through a very typical KGB interrogation, but I didn't cooperate. After 9 months of this isolation and interrogation in the prison here, there was a trial. But of course, these Soviet trials were a joke because they had already made up their minds. I was sentenced to 1.5 years in prison and then 5 years of exile in Siberia, where I worked in hard labor and various jobs up until 1986. So this was under Gorbachev. By this time, political prisoners were allowed to read, which I did, and I prayed. I would get down on my knees, and this would really bug them. They would punish me to get me to stop, but eventually they gave up. Exile was different from prison, and as you know, millions of people were exiled under the Soviets, and the whole purpose was to isolate people. You were deported to a faraway land, thousands of miles away from your homeland, usually placed in some small work village associated with work details. And everyone in the village believed you were some kind of antisocial criminal, which is what they were told. That is what exiles were, and you would be shunned. This had a big effect on your own family because everyone knew the horror stories about deportation and life in Siberia. And I know my mother worried about me a lot because we weren't allowed to communicate with each other. The entire experience was designed as a punishment. And as a deportee, you would hate being cut off and isolated from family and friends. But I tried to make the best of it, and I did manage to survive.
We all know now many, many thousands, millions even, were arrested and jailed in prisons and work camps all over the entire Soviet Union, and were sent to Siberia where they became slave laborers, forest work, mining, road building, digging canals. The total number of Lithuanian victims of Soviet terror, whether taken to Siberia, arrested, or killed, totaled 350,000. For comparison purposes, at the time, there were 2.5 million people in Lithuania. Therefore, 1 out of every 6 Lithuanians became a direct victim of Soviet terror.
The hardest times for me and my family were being separated from Father. It wasn't until years later that I went to Moscow and got his KGB file. He was shot. He was condemned to death and shot while in the slave labor camp. And then Mother died of starvation while we were on the Arctic Sea. Very painful for Romas and me, since we were unable to keep her alive. It was late October and the ground was frozen solid. We usually stacked the dead bodies in a hut, but Romas was determined to bury her. So he chopped a hole in the ground. It took him 2 days to cut a hole with some kind of stick, but we did bury her. And then after that, we were totally on our own, and we were on death's doorstep all the time.
The most painful part for me was to be separated from my family, to have the people I loved sent away while I'm in a labor camp. I felt pain all the time. The pain is present all day, every day, thinking of my family starving somewhere, up in the far north near the Arctic Ocean, not knowing if they will survive or if I will ever see them again.
I'm angry at the communists for the kind of system they imposed on us. I lived in various prisons in Russia for 12 years. They destroyed their own people. That's how crazy it all was. I witnessed how they destroyed even their own people. They never apologized, of course, but any apology would be useless. They don't think they did anything wrong. I just hope more people can learn about these terrible times of terror, so that what they did wrong in the past, crimes committed by the communists on us, would never happen again.
Koks pats sunkiausias momentas buvo? Pats sunkiausias, jeigu taip pasakyti.
For me, the worst was when they took father away and jailed my older brother. They deported my grandmother and brother and 2 sisters. And then, of course, they deported all of us for a 3rd time. And at our farm, they took everything, our land, our crops, our animals, our house. They even stripped the doors and the windows off their hinges. They wiped away our presents. They removed every trace of us as though we never existed. I don't want to judge them. Let God be their judge.
Sako, daug laiko praėjo.
Taigi jau nesinori neprisimyti. Čia gal Dievas juos teisia.
The God is the judge.
Those people took everything from me and my family and were so absolutely cruel to us. I can never forgive under any circumstances. I don't like to talk about this because when I do, my heart aches. It hurts too much. How can you forgive them? I do not know how to forgive them.
Today, I am not pleased with things. There are many former communists in our government today. They're in power. They stole all the property after communism fell. And today, they're all millionaires. It is very painful for us to see this injustice.
While we were in the Arctic, and people all around us were dying of starvation, I remember my mother once asked a god, "Why have you gone through all the trouble of bringing us out here to Siberia, only to starve and work us to death?" He answered, and I'll never forget it. He said, "We don't need your death. We need your pain and suffering." That's how cruel and evil it all was. I still don't fully understand it, but it happened to us.
I'm not happy with the way things have turned out. Our communist brothers, who kept the Soviets in power for 50 years, have stayed on and have adapted. One day they were communists. The next day they were super capitalists. Russian President Putin has stated publicly that there is no such thing as a former KGB or a former communist. Once you're KGB, you're always one. But we're in God's hands. I have hope for the future. They tried to destroy us, and as you have seen, they failed. So I am hopeful.
Visus Vilniečius šituo žodžiu, kuris, kaip mes tikimės, pradės užsipildyti teisiniu turiniu.
The resistance was difficult and symbolized the value of freedom. Therefore, so many people, young men and girls, were ready to die as a free people. Maybe with a hope of liberation, maybe even without any hope, but to surrender, to kneel, facing the terrible and degraded enemy and terrorist. It was so unacceptable. They preferred to fight to the end.
Why it's so important to remember and speak about the partisans? To me, they are the real freedom fighters. They are the symbol, the spirit, the strength of the human being and the will, because they knew that they are facing unbelievable forces against them. They exactly knew that they cannot win physically. To me, it symbolizes one thing, that commitment for freedom, and showing that nothing can destroy the determination to be free, to live free, speak free, and they fought that against the big odds.
Communism as a political system collapsed in 1989. The Russian tanks did not leave Lithuania until 1993. For 50 years, the Soviets engaged in a program to crush the national identities of the Lithuanian and Baltic peoples. The murders, the deportations, the tortures, imprisonments, exile, slave labor, and other crimes against humanity committed by the Soviets have never been addressed. No one has been called to account. The reign of terror they imposed on tens of millions of people lives on in the memories and lives of so many of its victims and survivors, even today.